Hi there, welcome everyone. Again, we are here for the Rain Garden Workshop, and we appreciate your time and thanks for logging in on time. We are recording this session, so we've got your mics and your cameras off. I'm Susan Lucas. I am the Event and Program Manager here at Udell Botanical Gardens, and I am super excited to have you here with us. And joining with Becca Truman. Becca, let me know if I'm misstating your title, the Watershed Coordinator for Oldham County. And we have Russ Turpin. He's a Senior Environmental Specialist. And Becca and Russ are going to be talking, teaching us about rain gardens, how they work, the benefits, and why you should consider having one. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Becca, and we'll look forward to great participation. Again, anything comes up, type it in the chat box, and then we'll get your questions answered. Thanks so much.
All right, well, thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for being here today, especially on a beautiful June weekend. We know that not all of us probably want to be in front of a screen, but now is a really great time to be thinking about rain gardens. We had this workshop on this weekend, partly because of just Udell's schedule, which I encourage you to look at for other events. But a big reason was because it's really great if you want to plant a rain garden in the fall. So June is a really good time to start thinking about where to plant your rain garden and kind of getting those logistics figured out. We just had some rain, so if maybe you walked around your property, you could see where a rain garden might be beneficial. Now's a good time to do that. So I'm going to jump in. Thank you again for being here. And as Susan said, if you have any questions, please use that chat feature and we will get to those as we go through. Okay, quick overview for this hour-and-a-half workshop we have here. I'm going to start off by just giving a very brief introduction to our local environmental program, which is our Curry's Fork Watershed Program. I'm going to hand it over to Russ Turpin from there, and that's going to be the majority of our time spent on rain gardens. And then I'm going to take it back and talk a few minutes about the rain garden that we installed at Udell last fall. And then I'm just going to briefly touch on some other local programs, resources, and opportunities available to you. So as Susan said, my name is Becca Truman. I'm the Watershed Coordinator and I work for Oldham County Fiscal Court. I've got about 6 years of as working as an environmental professional in watershed and stormwater management, agriculture, land conservation, and then public education engagement. And I'm so thrilled to have our main speaker today, Russ Turpin. And Russ, as Susan said, he's a team member of EcoGrow. EcoGrow is based out of Lexington, but they work all throughout the state. And Russ has a really awesome resume, but I'll just kind of give a couple highlights. He has over 22 years of experience as an environmental professional in ecological restoration and environmental stewardship. Russ is also a professional designer. He's a certified arborist and a very avid community member, especially in the Lexington area. So who is our audience? Just kind of setting us up here for what to expect. So this workshop, we're gearing this towards anyone interested, of course, in installing a rain garden, anyone concerned about problems such as global warming, species decline, and food security, anyone who would like to learn about actions to help nature, anyone that manages land, so this includes landowners, homeowners, as well as renters. And then the expectations you should have for today. So what should you expect from this next about 90 minutes? So we expect you to learn about rain gardens, what they are, how they function, and how to design and install one. To learn some or maybe a lot, just depending on where you're coming from, about land use change and consequences of increased stormwater and runoff. To broaden your understanding of your part in helping the environment. To gain practical knowledge you can use on your property and in your community. And then you should expect that the information you receive today will be rooted in sound science and given by professionals with extensive experience in the field, as I've stated. Okay, so like I said, I want to just give a quick intro to the Curry's Fork Watershed, a little bit of background to understand why we might be focused also on rain gardens. So The Currys Fork watershed, it's fully within Oldham County. You can see this blue outline here. Just a reminder for everybody, a watershed is simply the area of land that all the water that falls onto that land, typically here through rain precipitation, it's going to run across the land, infiltrate into the ground, and end up in the same streams. And so Currys Fork watershed, it doesn't have a very clear political boundary, but it's fully within Oldham County. I've got the LaGrange boundary. We can see down into Crestwood. So it's this sort of weird shape here that actually the outlet of it at the, where if you can see my cursor here, this leads into Floyd's Fork. So thinking about everything that we do in Currys Fork leads to Floyd's Fork. That leads to the Ohio River and then the Mississippi River and then the Gulf Coast. And then more specifically, thinking about watersheds, and if you live in the Currys Fork watershed, this might be more relevant to you, but when we're looking at what's happening on the land, we want to look even closer on the land. So not just the Currys Fork watershed, but where in the Currys Fork watershed things might be happening. So to do that, we look at what we call sub-watersheds. And if you've heard of North Fork Currys Fork, South Fork Currys Fork, Asher's Run, or the Currys Fork main stem, these are our sub-watersheds, so our areas within the Currys Fork watershed. Now I have this graphic here that I like to use of Russian nesting dolls because that's what watersheds are. You are always in a watershed, but it just depends on what we're looking at, the scale at which watershed we're interested in. Okay, so focusing on water quality problems, because the reason that we have our Currys Fork program is because we do have some issues that we're trying to address. So just to broadly cover those, the streams in the Currys Fork watershed are not meeting the standards of water quality according to the Environmental Protection Agency. That's our agency that has the Clean Water Act, manages water resources federally, and then at the state level, we work with the Kentucky Division of Water to manage our water resources. So I've got, again, this map of Oldham County. Circled here are the streams in the Currys Fork watershed. So they are red because according to EPA, Division of Water, they've gone out and assessed these streams. The streams have some concerns, and those concerns are related to both human health and aquatic wildlife. There have been excess levels of bacteria identified in the streams that we're concerned about, as well as low levels of oxygen, which means that those streams might not support aquatic wildlife because, similar to humans, aquatic wildlife also need air to breathe, even in the water. And then when we're thinking about the problems that we're finding more locally, to give a little bit of a view of what we're talking about when we're saying our streams aren't meeting water quality standards, what does that look like on the ground? What are we finding? So we're finding pollution, and when we say that, that means chemicals, fertilizers, sediments, road salts, oils, things like that. Flooding, so we have an increase in heavy rain events in this area that's leading to higher levels in our streams, and those streams then going out and flooding into our communities. Loss of land, reduced habitat for wildlife, algae bloom. So I've got a picture right here of an algae bloom, and those are pretty common, and some could be harmful, some are okay, but they have implications as to, you know, what's going into that stream to result in those that algae blooming, and then what could happen if that algae bloom lasts for a really long time. And then excess bacteria levels. So like I mentioned before, so our waterways might not be safe for human contact because of those excess bacteria levels. And bacteria comes from a lot of sources. We're most concerned about human sources because that's what could cause sickness and viruses. But from a water quality standpoint, we're also concerned about bacteria that's from farm animals, dogs, wildlife like geese and deer, and then point sources from, so if there's a pipe that's actually directly going into our streams from somewhere. So we're taking a very broad perspective on what's happening on the land to try to then understand what's going on in our streams and why ultimately our Division of Water, our EPA saying that our streams aren't meeting those standards to be safe for us to be in. Just a couple of quick more details here about our program. So it started in 2004 through Oldham County Fiscal Court. Again, we're working on an effort to improve our streams in the Currys Fork watershed. Now I'm focusing on the Curry's Fork watershed, but what I'm describing here with our streams that don't meet standards and our issues, this is not an isolated problem. This is happening all across the state, but our program in itself is very unique, and there's not actually a whole lot of individual watershed programs, which we would love to see more of, but just understanding that this is a unique program. The resources and funding that we're providing to the community through this program are very unique and special. So we're really glad that you're here today taking advantage of that. I'm the designated watershed coordinator, and I work in the county engineer's office. And my job is broadly working to collaborate with our community stakeholders. So that's public individuals, as well as government agencies, organizations, and businesses to try to address some of these issues I talked about. And then again, our input from the public and our stakeholders is really important, and we need broad interest from several groups in the community if we're going to really have targeted impacts and improve our streams. On the right here, you see a watershed plan. So we have a watershed plan, and that's exactly what that is. It's a plan on what's going on in the Curry's Fork watershed and really details what our problems are and what we need to do to address those problems, getting to our goal of clean water and streams that meet those standards. I'll highlight that one of the best things about our watershed plan is it does really identify those solutions, both at a watershed wide scale. So thinking back to when I was talking about the watersheds, what do we need to do in the entire watershed? So things like education and outreach. And then what do we need to do at those smaller, at the smaller scale? So thinking about those sub watersheds. And that's where we get into thinking about where do we need to focus fixing failing septic systems? Where's the best places to conserve land, etc. And then I'll just mention some of our recent projects. So some of these you may or may not be aware of, but just so you know, start here at the top left. So last year we installed stream crossing signs. In the middle here, we have, sorry about that, my cat is doing something. Last year we installed a rain garden at Udell, so I'm going to talk about that more later on. We also, in the past couple of years, have completed a native plant garden, a pollinator garden with some rain barrels at the LaGrange Welcome Center. We've been focusing on tree and planting of live stakes, which are future trees, I like to say, along our streams and on private property. We have a septic system cost share program, as well as we're focusing on getting more rain barrels out there, and we have a rain barrel cost share program as well. And then I know I've thrown a lot at you, but a few current ways that I encourage you to get involved. And if you have other thoughts or interests or ideas, I definitely encourage you to reach out to me and let's talk about that more. But we have our Friends of Curry's Fork. This is our local watershed group. We're meeting monthly. We've started meeting in person again, and we are meeting on the third Wednesday of the month at 10 a.m. We have our, like I said, our rain barrel cost share program. So we had some extra funding after we did our initial program in April. And so if you're a resident of Oldham County, you have an opportunity to receive up to $50 back on a rain barrel. So I encourage you to take advantage of that because we only have that for a couple more weeks right now. We've got to meet the deadline of the fiscal year. And then continuing to focus on pollinator gardens. My personal goal is to get more people involved in helping with pollinator gardens, spreading the word of their importance, helping to educate our neighbors and our community. And so if you're interested in this, I encourage you to participate in participate in our meetup. It hasn't been determined when we're meeting up yet because I'm going to get input from the public on when you want to meet, and then we'll figure it out from there. And this is just my information, and you'll get this all after the workshop as well. So don't worry about rushing to write anything down. But the best way to contact me is email, and the best way to know about what's going on is Facebook. If Facebook doesn't work for you, then email. I have an email list that I'll send you out some updates on what's going on a couple times a month. Try not to send too many emails out, but I encourage you to get involved. We also have our YouTube page, which is really just the repository for all of our videos. And now we will go on to talk about rain gardens. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and check the chat. And I might need to fix something here. Let's see.
No chats yet, Becca. I just typed in there where folks could add their comments and questions when they're ready.
Perfect, great. Well, this is a good time. So 1:17, so we want to give plenty of time for Russ to go through his presentation. And I will stop there. Take it over, Russ, whenever you are ready. And thank you.
All right, thank you all. How's this coming through?
Looks great.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. Well, hi, my name's Russ. So thanks again for taking the time to do this. I'm going to be speaking about the essential elements of rain gardens. This is going to be fairly broad in content. And you've got some great expertise at Udell Gardens to talk about specific plants you might have in mind. And you've got some great expertise in the Curious Fork watershed with Becca. So in terms of exact places or getting a little help on connecting some rain gardens with some water quality issues, you've got local talent at hand participating in this workshop too. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about kind of broader picture stuff. Oh, skip one. Okay, so I want to start with this quote from Wendell Berry: "The care of earth is our most ancient and most worthy, and after all, our most pleasing responsibility. To cherish what remains of it and to foster its renewal is our only hope." And also from Thomas Fuller: "He that plants trees loves others beside himself." So I think you can probably connect with some of the values in there. If you're taking the time to learn about rain gardens today and about stormwater, you'll see some values in that as far as what we're doing is going to be benefiting more than ourselves. So kind of jumping right into it, I'm going to, again, kind of be talking big picture stuff and giving you some information, some of the essential elements that I don't see a lot of in some of the water or the rain garden information or resources. I believe you've got an attachment, the rain garden manual that was sent out. So a lot of what I'm talking about will match up with what's in that rain garden manual. Maybe I'm just going to give some reinforcing information to that. So one key thing in stormwater speak is non-point source pollution. So this is essentially these types of pollution that Becca hit upon that don't really come out of a pipe from a factory or industrial area. These are kind of all across the landscape. So these could be pet waste, animal waste, anything like that, cigarette butts, it could be fertilizers, lawn clippings, all that kind of stuff comes into play. And in stormwater speak, you'll hear of BMPs, which stands for Best Management Practices. So there's a variety of different ways and methodologies to address non-point source pollution. So rain gardens are kind of one BMP, one best management practice. And within this realm of best management practices, there's a lot of functions. There's infiltration, filtration, detention, retention. And you don't need to know all of this. I would usually sum it up. If you're looking at a basin or something that you would associate with stormwater, I usually say detention delays water, retention, it remains. So that's usually how I keep that straight. But I'm going to go into this a little bit more. So a lot of times these different functions might have a biological component. So you might hear bioinfiltration, biofiltration, biodetention, bioretention. So all of these I'm generalizing under the umbrella of green infrastructure. And basically green infrastructure is a stormwater management practice that's going to incorporate some kind of a living system. So it's plants, it's soil, or other microorganisms that might live in the soil, and these natural processes. Oftentimes, one thing that's unique about green infrastructure is it usually has a lot of other benefits that could be beautification, wildlife values, fruit and nut producing trees and shrubs, conservation, energy impact. So a lot of other value added kind of benefits from green infrastructure. So another key term you're going to want to know is impervious surfaces. So these are the kinds of surfaces like parking lots, roofs, sidewalks, any kind of even compacted soil, things that prevent water from soaking into the soil, and that's what's going to be producing runoff. So traditionally in our communities, how they've been built over the past 50 to 100 years. It's what I call the 3 C's of stormwater, specifically gray stormwater, which is using a lot of concrete. It was about collecting and conveying water and moving it to a stream or river as quickly as possible. So scenes like this, where you might see a lot of concrete channels or concrete pipe, was pretty popular for getting water away from us as soon as possible. What that's also done is taken some of the pollutants, these non-point source pollutants, and put them to our creek and put them into our water resources as soon as possible as well. So Becca mentioned harmful algal blooms. So this is, algae is kind of a natural thing, but what's kind of unnatural is when they get a lot of nutrients. You can think about fertilizers or pet waste, lawn clippings, things like that, get into the water really quick in these high volumes that nature wasn't really ready for. So this is something that does affect human health, and it does affect our water resources. Think about drinking water supply. So I'm putting this little graphic in here to show kind of what happens with runoff, or how we get different amounts of runoff as we've got greater impervious surface. So in the upper left, you see what's called a natural ground cover, which would have been Kentucky, in the prior to colonization, prior to Daniel Boone crossing the mountains, but certainly prior to a lot of our urbanization and development. What I want to point out in that is only about 10% of the rain that fell would go into runoff. Most of it was either, kind of split between infiltrating into the soil or evapotranspiration, which is the mechanism of plants to convert that water through photosynthesis and send it back up into the air, or just evaporation off the ground. What you can notice on this is as the impervious surface increases, we get more runoff, right? Less infiltration and a little bit less evapotranspiration. So this is a picture from around 1910 of the area I live in Lexington. So let's say around 100 years ago, plus or minus, it was agricultural. You can see some circular areas. Those were probably racetracks. You can probably tell where some trees are, a lot of open pasture, probably some row crop. So as I flip through these slides, you're going to see some street names pop up and an overlay into where we're at now. So this is the same location. And you can see, the streets, the residential areas, you can see shopping centers, big parking lots, and things like that. So this is an image of Wolf Run watershed, where I'm at, and where that picture was taken. And what I want to point out to you is the red areas. The red is indicating impervious surfaces. So again, parking lots, streets, rooftops, sidewalks, things like that. Right now, we're at about 35, 40% impervious area in Lexington, or in this watershed in particular. So this graph is showing the increase of our urban areas. So this is from the USDA Natural Resources. This inventory is between 1982 and 2012, so it needs to be updated a little bit, but about 37% of our urban areas, or think about impervious area, was just developed in the past 30 years. That's a lot quicker than the streams in our watersheds had developed. So again, when you think back about this, how much things have changed, if we go from the natural ground cover on the top at 10% runoff to, let's say, 35 to 50% impervious runoff just below that, that's 30% runoff. So that's 3 times more water getting into our creeks and waterways. So people have been looking at this phenomenon of urban stream syndrome. What happens when all this runoff starts getting into streams? The streams can't really hold it. It's more water than they're designed to carry. And oftentimes people are seeing an association that once we get typically above 10% impervious area, and again, I'm right now about 35% watershed. So once you start getting above that 10%, you're going to start seeing noticeable changes, especially in the stream habitat, the physical structure. A lot of things get washed out, a lot of sediment moves in, and that doesn't support some of the wildlife. So a lot of the stormwater you see getting into your waterway, it didn't always occur prior to development. So this picture is showing a little channel, a ditch, nothing phenomenal about that. What I want to point out are the the roots that are sticking out on the banks and these rocks that are kind of sticking out. So obviously trees wouldn't grow their roots out into the air. This is a subdivision that was built in the 90s. So just in a matter of about 30 years, it had eroded from just kind of a grassy swale to this channel. Where did the soil go? It went into the neighborhood's pond. So eventually they're going to have to dredge that out, and there's a cost. So something to think about here is typically on Kentucky's average rainfall, which we haven't had an average year in a couple of years, we usually get around 45, 46 inches total throughout a year. So for every square foot of impervious surface is going to produce about 27.9 gallons of runoff each year. So if you have 1,000 square feet, which is maybe a very small home, a lot of homes might be 2,000 square feet. So every 1,000 square feet of impervious area is going to be about 28,000 gallons. If you got a 2,000 square foot home, you probably have as much water coming off of your roof as you use in a typical year. So something to put that in perspective. So I want to throw out this idea that rain is natural, but stormwater isn't really natural. So this is a picture showing an incised and eroded stream bank, all this soil, this great farm soil, beautiful soil. It's been, washed out on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. And here's another example. You can see this guy standing looking up at the banks, a lot of erosion, a lot of runoff that didn't always be there, it wasn't always there. You can see fairly young trees, so they haven't been there that long. That's a good indicator of how quickly this area is eroding. And in urban areas, we get this problem of sanitary sewer overflows. You'll hear the acronym SSO, or combined sewer overflows. That's when a combined sewer overflow is when the system has sanitary and storm sewers combined together. What that results is sewage in the creek. No one really wants that. So this is pictures of erosion that's gotten into or affected some of our infrastructure. That manhole wasn't really placed, it wasn't in that exposed stream bank when it was built in. You don't need to look at all the numbers on this. Basically, I'm just showing water quality sampling results. This is from Lexington. The red means bad. We've got really bad problems with human fecal material and bacteria pathogens getting into our creeks from sewer overflows. Well, why is that important? Well, at some point, someone's going to drink this water. In Lexington, downstream of us, is Georgetown. So Royal Spring, the Royal Spring Aquifer, is the water supply for the city of Georgetown. So this is all about being good neighbors. And I want to shift gears just a little bit, and this will kind of tie back into ecosystem services. So I'm going to get this concept in your head too. Ecosystem services are basically all the benefits that people receive from both natural and managed ecosystems. I think this picture, this little cartoon here, really shows it pretty well, where you've got trees and in their metabolic process, they're photosynthesizing, they're taking in carbon dioxide, they're releasing out oxygen. We in turn breathe in that oxygen, it goes through our system, we breathe out carbon dioxide. So this is this cycle here. Much like the water cycle. So ecosystem services could be anything like, the production of oxygen. We can grow a lot of our food, we're capturing and storing CO2. You can get shade and cooling values. A lot of different benefits we get from a good functioning ecosystem, especially clean water. So I'm going to bring that into rain gardens. So it's a simple, cost-effective means of using stormwater as a resource, not trying to get rid of it as we had in the past as quickly as possible, but try to use it for those benefits. So basically a rain garden is going to be a shallow landscape basin. We want water to slowly filter through some plants and some soil. We're trying to recreate some of that function of the natural processes and creating those ecosystem services. Rain gardens are going to be really good at capturing our most common types of pollution, which are nutrients and sediment. So I've come up with 2 rules for what makes a rain garden a rain garden. So this is nothing official. No one else has necessarily acknowledged this, but it's my little rules I come up with on how I can tell if a rain garden is a rain garden. For one, it collects stormwater runoff. For two, it infiltrates water into the soil. So for example, if there's a landscape planting somewhere that's not associated with stormwater runoff or it's not getting runoff to it, I consider that a landscape planting, but not necessarily a rain garden. If water is coming in, stormwater is coming in, there's a lot of plants. For me, for it to be a rain garden, it needs to infiltrate that water into the soil. Otherwise, it could be a retention pond, it could be a wetland, it could be something else, another name, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a rain garden. So again, it might fill up with water, but a rain garden is not a pond, it's not a wetland. We want deep, permeable soils. A lot of times we get questions about mosquitoes or concerns, but basically when the rain gardens drain down, they drain down quicker than that 7-day life cycle for mosquitoes to breed. So it actually is a negative or net loss of mosquitoes. Soil type is going to be really important here. You really want to assess the permeability of your soil, and that's going to be pretty critical in the rain garden design. You can often pull up county soil maps. One of my first usual go-to is the Web Soil Survey. You can see the website address at the bottom there. That's through the USDA NRCS. So that's pretty easy to get to. I'm going to show you an example here. You can map out the area that you're looking at, and it's going to pull up a kind of a map and show you what kind of soils are in the area. I'm going to say that if you are looking into a really urban area, it might come up and just say urban soil, meaning it's been monkeyed with so many times, dug up, brought in, hauled, this, that. They can't really define it. And I would generally look at a pretty broad area for these soil types. You might be able to see that there's some different lines showing the different boundaries of the soil. If you go out there digging, you're not going to see a sudden line in between soil types. So take it that is kind of a big picture, broad idea, but it's a good first step. It might just take 5 minutes to do, but it's going to be a good first step. It's going to produce a lot of information, but here's what you want to look for. Looking in the middle there under properties and qualities, you'll see drainage class. Well drained is what you want for a rain garden. You can look at that infiltration rate, moderately high. If it's 0.2 to 0.5 inches per hour, that's going to be plenty. Looking at the depth of water table is a good indicator, and the frequency of flooding or frequency of ponding. You don't want it to be ponding or flooding a lot, because again, that wouldn't be a good sign of infiltration. And you can look at that typical soil profile. I find that to be helpful. Again, don't take it for everything. You still got to check on-site values. So a good way to start is with the soil percolation test. There's some step-by-step instructions in the rain garden manual. You can look up other soil percolation tests, but basically, essentially what you're doing is digging a hole, filling it with water. You might come back after 24 or 48 hours, do it again, but you're going to be evaluating how quickly does that water absorb into the soil. Again, we want a rain garden to be above the water table, so it's not a wetland. Wetlands are fine, wetlands are great, but I just want to make that distinction. So oftentimes when we're even in the design phase, this is before going out and just digging, we're going to dig a hole, we're going to go deeper than the bottom of our rain garden we expect to be, because all that soil that's below the rain garden is really going to be affecting the rain garden. If you can imagine, if you're digging out 6 inches or a foot of soil to build your rain garden, well, that soil isn't going to be what you need to be testing, right? Because that soil is going to be gone. So dig down a little bit deeper, and that's going to give you some good information. Well, what happens if you're digging around and you come up with a rock? So this is not uncommon, especially you can see this is kind of this was a school here. So this has been a lot of modified, filled area. Well, then you get an excavator or move somewhere else, find another spot. But this is why doing some of this work before you've got all your plants and they're just sitting there waiting. You want to do some poking around and digging around to see what you got. Now, if you've got equipment, if you've got bobcats and skid steers and excavators and a team of people to do this kind of stuff. You can do these things, you can make it work. So this is an example of a big area that we worked on. The soil wasn't great, so we made it good. We made it infiltrate by putting in some gravel, some French drain systems, some piping, backfilled it with sand. Again, you probably wouldn't do this, but you could do this on a very small scale in your yard. So just because you see this, quarter acre lot here, just think about it as a couple, 10 square feet on your backyard. You can do something like this with a shovel. And this is what it looks like. So part of this is actually just fescue turf area. And we did do a lot of planting of some trees and some wildflowers in there. So location, you want to think about this. Don't be too eager to build a rain garden where you see a lot of water standing, especially for many days. That's not a prime location. You don't want to put a rain garden too close to a building. You don't want that water maybe getting into like a leaky basement or a crawl space. I would stay at least about 10 feet away. That's kind of a good rule of thumb, and especially downhill of a building. You want to think about ways that you can redirect that rain from like a downspout or where it's a problem area, how to get it into the rain garden without being an erosion problem. And really important, locate and identify buried underground utility lines. It's really easy. In Kentucky, you call before you dig, BUD, B-U-D. You can dial 811 and they'll talk you through that process. And that's always worthwhile. So I really encourage you to do that even in the design phase before you start going out there with having your plant set out and everything. So I'm going to walk you through kind of a little example. This is a project I worked on with a workshop out in Owensboro. They've got a house that they wanted to build a rain garden off of. So this is the area that was kind of identified for the rain garden. You can see it's we've got a driveway, we've got a sidewalk, we've got a downspout right in the middle, and that's what they wanted to access. But I want you to take notice of the little vents in this area. So this is a house on a crawl space. So that'd be another example of where you don't want water getting up underneath that house, to be mindful of. Next to a sidewalk or next to a driveway, you want to, just consider, what if someone were to just step off of the sidewalk or accidentally drive off that driveway? You want to be able to have a little room in between a sidewalk or driveway in your rain garden. So then we had the utility lines located, and lo and behold, there's a gas line running right through where we wanted to take it. So that restricted some of our usable area. Nonetheless, marching on, we pulled up in Google Earth aerial map, and I typically use that to measure some volume, how much water would be coming off of this rooftop, and how big of a rain garden do we need to build here. So you can see that little blue polygon. I basically measured off that portion of the roof that had a downspout going into the area that we were looking at. I came up with the roof area and I multiplied that by 1 inch for a 1 inch rain event. That gave me a volume. To meet that volume, we could do a combination of different sizes and shapes, lengths, widths, depths, that would all be the same volume. We chose about a 10-foot by 10-foot by 6-inch deep rain garden that give us about 50 cubic feet, which would meet that volume of runoff coming from that downspout. However, what wasn't looked at was the parking lot and driveway, which was a huge area that was contributing a lot of water to that rain garden area. So really the water quality volume, the volume of water that would be coming down there was about 4,000 gallons. It's a lot bigger than what we're looking at for that downspout. So nonetheless, we wanted to go ahead and do this and just make the best of it we could. We knew we needed to keep away from the crawl space. We didn't want it too close to that driveway. And we've got, if the water was overflowing, it might overflow by the sidewalk. So those were some of our limitations. But anyways, this again is looking using Google Earth. So that's a great tool if you're working remotely to kind of see what else is coming in. And aside from that driveway that I measured, you can see some of the adjacent properties, some of those roofs, those downspouts are also coming, discharging onto that parking lot. So there's probably even more water coming into this area. So it started off just kind of looking at that one downspout, not a big deal, but there's a lot more stuff coming into this area. But again, we looked at our available space, and although we were only going to do about 4.5% of the total volume of water that would be coming to it, it's still going to be better than nothing. And here is the result. So this was a team project done with the Owensboro Water Resource Group and some volunteers. And I like the way that they used bricks around the edging. So that gave it some stability and some good definition, some little native plants in there. So I think it worked out really well. And you see all smiles, so it worked out really well. So the shape and form, this is where you can get really creative for it. You always want to think about, though, that there's always going to be a big storm event. So you always want to allow some overflow from the larger storms to get out of the rain garden without scouring or creating further erosion. Rain gardens are not going to replace other stormwater systems. You always want to think about, what if you get a 1 inch or 1 inch in an hour or a big 2 to 3 inch storm event? A rain garden's not really going to be designed to hold all that water. You want to be able to clean sediment, soil, sand, debris, stuff like that. So you don't want that to necessarily clog up the rain garden, but just over time, periodically, you might want to be able to get in there and work, get some of that out. And as best you can, you want to try to dissipate the energy of that water. If you can spread it and slow it, you're going to take a lot of that erosive force out of it. So you can use little splash rocks and things like that to kind of help discharge some of that energy. So this is an example of what happens just after you get done putting the last little bit of mulch and just the icing on the cake for a rain garden. So this is a project out in Winchester. We got one of those huge, like 3/4 inches in an hour. So there's a lot of massive runoff just as we finished this rain garden. And lo and behold, it held up pretty well. What you can see coming across this backside, we put in a lot of decorative gravel in the low spots, so that allowed that flowing water to kind of flow across. If it had just been soil or just been mulch, chances are that would have washed and that would have carried. So some of this gravel on there gave it a little protective area so that those high flows can go through. And you'll see on the far left, we did make a little berm and a weir, that little weir, or kind of like a miniature dam that was made out of rock, so that that rock could convey that water on down. It held up pretty well. I was pleasantly surprised. You can do a lot of fun stuff with it too. This is one of the first rain gardens I built off of my house. You can see a downspout. So you can think about different materials and just kind of have fun with it. Especially from a downspout, you're not going to get a whole lot of runoff. So it's kind of fun. I like doing dry stack rock. That works really well, especially in Kentucky. We've got that aesthetic. It's a natural and native material, usually readily available, and does a really good job of letting that water kind of come into the side slopes and provides that stability. So this is me on a happy day planting one of my favorite rain gardens I built, which was the Coca-Cola rain garden. So you can see that here from Google Earth. Hopefully you can make out the shape of a Coke bottle. That's my intention on that. And this can actually be seen if you're flying in from the north into Lexington over the airport. A lot of planes fly in that direction. So hopefully it can be seen from above. And that is receiving runoff from the parking lot. And we installed a pipe off that drainage area. And this is what it looks like on the ground in its prime. And this was a rain garden. It was one of the first with the Bluegrass Rain Garden Alliance initiative about 12 years ago, 10, 11, 12, 11 years ago, yeah. And another picture, you can see used a lot of little blue stem on the edges for kind of a perimeter. It does really well in very dry areas, which hopefully your rain garden will be drier more than it's wet. You can see some gray-headed coneflower in there, some asters. So this is kind of a late summer. What it looks like a lot of goldfinch came into here. So Coca-Cola was pretty happy with that. So they let us do another project out there. This is in Lexington. And so this is one of our designs. We tried to incorporate that little swoosh or kind of the line with the Coca-Cola, the font and the graphics. So this is me giving a tour inside that rain garden. So it's a much larger rain garden. You can see some of the trees and shrubs and grasses and stone and a lot of mulch. This looks more like a conventional landscape, not a lot of wildflowers in there. This is what it looks like when it's full of water. So this is when it's working. So yeah, this is, again, pretty soon after construction, worked just fine. You can see two little blue posts sticking up on the side. Those were monitoring instruments by the University of Kentucky. They were doing some undergraduate research there. And I'll get into that later if we've got time. So they were pretty happy with that. So we recycled the Coke bottle and used that shape and form out in Kansas on a project out there. Again, bird's eye view looking down. So hopefully you can make out the Coke bottle shape. This is again kind of looking down and you can kind of see some of the facility. It was a distribution area, so a lot of industrial area, a lot of runoff going into that rain garden. And you can see it on the left corner, kind of get some idea of scale. These are semi trucks parked in that lot. So a lot of big roof area, a lot of big parking lot spaces, and going into that rain garden. This is what it looks like on the ground. On the ground, you can't really see that Coke bottle shape. It's almost too big to see, but we put in a lot of Midwest native grasses and wildflowers in that. So the plants, typically you're almost always going to see native plants associated with rain gardens. They generally have very deep roots. I don't want to say you should only use native plants. I'm just saying that's pretty typical. But again, what kind of plant was not part of my definition of what makes a rain garden a rain garden. And this is a schematic that's kind of used a lot to show the deep roots of some of these native plants. I will say that these are representations of prairie plants and a prairie soil, which can be very deep. If you don't have 5 or 6 feet of a great loam, chances are the roots aren't going to go down that much. If you're 2 feet off of bedrock, the plant roots aren't necessarily going to go down another 4 more feet. So this is kind of used to illustrate that native plants often have really deep root systems, but the soil is really going to be what controls the rain garden. Now, one of the benefits of the rain gardens is they've got some established partnerships within our ecosystem. So on this plant, the plant is common milkweed, and you see the monarch butterfly. So the milkweed and the monarch butterfly have a very special relationship. So the monarch's only going to be laying its eggs on milkweed. So if you want monarchs to continue or to visit your garden, you could plant the milkweed in there. That could be part of your plant selection. So yeah, a rain garden could be a monarch way station if you want it to be. And I'm putting this slide in here. This is about the ecoregions of Kentucky. So no matter where you're at, I would say you would probably want to pay attention about what would naturally be here. So you can think about that too. A lot of Kentucky would have been a forest, maybe some savannas, a little bit of prairies, but a lot of woodlands. So don't be afraid of recreating that woodland scene. Don't be afraid of using trees and shrubs in the rain garden. I think you'll find that they are really good performers. But nonetheless, people like color, people like the pollinators, and so generally you're going to see most information, most plant recommendations are going to be full sun perennial wildflowers. Again, I don't think that should be the limitation or exclusive to that kind of scenario. You can think about putting other shade tolerant plants, depends on where your rain garden is located. So this is a proud team with another rain garden installed. This is clearly at a kind of parking lot downstream of a shopping center, and just clicking through here. So of course we build it and then it rains and fills up with water. Um, and this is a picture kind of that first growing season. So we had some Rudbeckia, some Black-eyed Susan, we had some purple cone flower, some cardinal flower, some little blue stem in there, some blue vervain. So we tried a real mixture of stuff, which was kind of interesting. I'll get to that in the future because maintenance comes into play. You might need to actually water your rain garden if you're planting, just like anything else. Sometimes plants will need a little help getting through the first growing season, but you don't really need to do any kind of fertilizers, especially with native plants. And you do want to do a good job of mulching your beds. That's going to help retain a lot of that moisture. It's going to help that soil quality. So again, mulching, especially with an organic material like standard bark or wood chips and things like that, are going to be very helpful. So the same rain garden there, what you see now is a lot of Johnson grass. So this is what happens when the owners don't maintain a rain garden. So we had some weeds coming in. We had a lot of native plants in there though, too, that were hidden underneath the Johnson grass. But all it takes is really come out on an early Saturday morning when it's nice and cool, get out there and just, kind of pull some weeds. So in a couple of, maybe an hour, maybe two, we made a big dent in this rain garden. So what's interesting is what you see that had thrived really well. Again, considering that all the Johnson grass and stuff that was in there. So what had thrived really well was not the cardinal flower and black-eyed Susans, the Baptisia, the blue false indigo, blue star, that did really well, and swamp rosemallow did really well. So those are pretty sturdy plants. So that might be something to think about in your plant selection. So going back to the Coca-Cola rain garden where we did mostly trees and shrubs, this was some serviceberry, and you can see some dormant little blue stem. We put in a few bulbs just for fun, just to see how that works. But what you see is a lot of trees and shrubs. Again, using a big patch of that little blue stem, we left it up through the winter for some interest. And yeah, so it doesn't have to be all wildflowers or perennial things like that. So the same picture going back there, that tour. So a few examples I want to show just to see, is this a rain garden? So this just to kind of show some of my projects and things I've done, and some things I haven't done. But what you see here is a little bed. These are two shots of the same location. So it was runoff coming down from a street. This is one I built, and I used the dry stack rock, which is, works really well. So yeah, we're going to consider this a rain garden. It's getting stormwater runoff, and it's able to absorb that water and infiltrate in. Another rain garden here. This was used by the photographer Betty Hall. So she takes a lot of pictures of butterflies and pollinators. So she's got a lot of milkweed. So this is a rain garden that, again, works really well. This was up in Madison, Wisconsin. I didn't do this project, but this is a picture of a rain garden up there, some upper Midwest plants. And what you can see in the bottom is the curb cut inlet off of the street. So water's coming in off of the parking lot. So yes, it's stormwater runoff getting in there in a little basin, and the plants are thriving. So now this one I came across, it's pretty clearly intended to do some kind of stormwater function, but this is all pond liner. So it was not designed to infiltrate. So we can't call this a rain garden. And this one was close by. Again, you can kind of see it's a landscaped area. There's a head wall in there, so it's getting stormwater, but it was really more designed to hold water. And what you can kind of see in this middle here, this little black thing is actually a pond fountain. So it was intended to hold water. So here we've got a little planting in a parking lot, and I would consider this a rain garden. So it's getting runoff from a parking lot area, and you get the different kinds of, most of these are probably native plants, and we got a tree in there helping pull that water out. So this is an example of a installation in a city park. What you can see is the parking lot, the driveway, the asphalt area. So we've got impervious area, we've got runoff. You do not see a curb. So this runoff can essentially just flow right off of that asphalt into this planted basin. You can see over here what I call a beehive inlet. So that's an overflow. So if there's more water than this little basin can hold, it has a way to discharge out. What about the soil? Yes, it was very loose and amended soil, and you can tell because when the backhoe, when the Bobcat drove into it, it sank. So this isn't my project, but you can tell it must have been pretty good soil, real loose and fluffy and mulched. So I'm sure they did fix that up, but just another thing in there. Now, is this for a rain garden? On the construction plans, it said bioinfiltration basin. Well, we can see stormwater head walls. So it discharges, it's getting stormwater runoff. There's about 5 head walls that discharge to this point. But looking at the algae in the water, we know that water's been there for a while, so it's not really infiltrating. So despite what it might have been named, I can't really say this is going to fit my definition of a rain garden. What if you do have a stormwater basin that you want to retrofit? So this is an example of a project we did at a school. They had a typical stormwater basin that had a concrete channel, a little flume going right down the middle, and that just sent the water in and sent the water out really quickly. So what we did is we built a small little dam in that concrete flume. You can see it going across there. And then we cut out part of that side of that concrete and excavated some material in the bottom of that stormwater basin. We amended that and we plant a lot of, it's hard to see right here, but a lot of these are little willow live stakes. So the kinds of things that Becca had planted this past winter and into spring, you can use live stakes, and that's all we planted in there. And it's doing really well. So the water comes in, the first little bit of water that's got more of the runoff will come in and will fill in that little basin. When we get big storm events or there's too much water, it can bypass out and still go out the infrastructure that was built in there. So we don't have a problem with getting too much water or more water than it can handle. And this is another rain garden. It might be hard to tell because you can see maybe a basin, you can see some of the wildflowers in there. And what we did is we took a pipe from the downspout off that porch and off that building, you can see towards the left. We ran some pipes underground to get it away from a building. This was a historic building that already had some issues with water getting into the basement. So we wanted to make sure we were far enough away from that building and downhill from that building before putting in the rain garden. So this is the point where I can pause here and take some questions or keep going. How are we doing?
Any questions in the chat right now. Feel free if anybody has them to type them in.
Okay. Well, if you can hang on, I'm going to go through a little bit of research and some studies that we've done on the effectiveness of rain gardens. So we'll still have time for Q&A at the end. So we've got a little bit more. I'll go through another a few more minutes really quick. So it looks good, but how do you know if rain gardens are working to improve water quality? So this is a neat tool that you can use that's not what you might think associated directly with rain gardens, but I would encourage you to get familiar with this. This is the National Tree Benefit Calculator. You can see on this website, treebenefits.com/calculator. You can go to that, you can type in your zip code. That gives a little bit of a reference to where you're at, what kind of weather patterns you have. And then you can select in a particular tree that you have in mind. So here's what's interesting. Here's the connection with stormwater. So it can give you a little pie chart down here, and it can give you dollar values for how much, what's the value of the ecosystem services, those ecosystem benefits that we were talking about earlier. So stormwater is this little kind of orangish, yellowish section here. So this was saying this particular tree, each tree would be a little bit different, but this one was providing about $17.87 of stormwater benefit each year. So that would be one resource you might want to check out, particularly obviously if you're using trees in your rain garden, which I'd encourage you to keep in mind or consider. So I mentioned a lot about, or had examples of the Coca-Cola project that we did in Lexington. So this was a study that one of the students in UK used, did some research on the rain garden after we built. So they put in some instrumentation so they could see how much water is coming in, what kind of volume it is, how long it's in the rain garden, what are the levels, how quickly it gets absorbed, and things like that. This chart is from that report. It's a little bit hard to understand, so I'm going to talk you through it. The red bars on the top are coming down from 0, and this is in millimeters, so it's not in inches, but that's showing how much rain fell. The bottom graph is going to be a little bit more telling. The blue line is the inflow, so how much water was coming into the system. Then the dotted line is the water level, and that solid line here, this was the ground surface of the rain garden. So this was the water level relative to the ground surface. So this is, let's see, again, in millimeters, or in meters, which I'm not great with, but this was the water level below the ground surface of the rain garden. So you can see as we had water coming in, it came up and was slowly kind of discharging out. We did another study with a school in Lexington. It was going through some remodeling. So we wanted to see what kind of best management practices, again, that BMP, what kind of different BMPs or practices could be done with this school as it was being remodeled. So we looked at a variety of different methodologies in different locations to kind of figure out, well, what's going to work the best? So we were taking a lot of different factors into mind here. You don't need to look at all this stuff, but basically what I want to share with you is that we were evaluating the different surface types, how much pollution would be coming off of a particular surface type. So surface type would be whether it was the roof or a parking lot or a road. We compared the effectiveness of these different best management practices, the BMPs, came up with a volume, and looked at what's the cost of design installation in a typical 20 years of service life. So this is a lot, but that's not the important stuff. I'm going to get to the important stuff. So we have evaluated each of these best management practices, had a little table. So here's one thing to consider. This is one thing I think is missing from a lot of rain garden information. Basically, what I want to show you is these are the pollution concentration from source areas. So again, if you see TSS, that's total suspended solids. So think about sediment, which is one of our big pollutants. TP is total phosphorus, which we don't have a whole lot of concern with in our waterways. Not as much as what you see as TN, which is total nitrogen. So nitrogen and sediment are some of our big pollutants in Kentucky. And what I want you to pay attention to is off of a roof, whether it's commercial, industrial, residential, not a lot of sediment. And the nitrogen levels were roughly equivalent across the board. So is the phosphorus too. Because when you think about it, if you had a rain barrel, you're collecting roof runoff, you can reuse that water. You might not, you wouldn't drink it right from the tap, but not all that dirty. Okay. When you think about a driveway, a parking lot, a highway, or a street, you're thinking about a lot more sediments. You're thinking about oils, greases, salts. You don't really have that from a roof. And lawns had the most sediment, the most phosphorus, and the most nitrogen coming off of them. So think about that's where the pet waste would be coming from. That's where the fertilizers or excessive fertilizers, excessive nutrients, that's where that's coming from. So I want you to think a little bit about where is the pollutant source, what kind of surface would be receiving water when you're siting and locating a rain garden, because these different surfaces are going to have different pollutant loads coming in. So this is one example of one little rain garden that this is kind of a theoretical practice here. It was catching water from a parking lot. It was only able to size the restrictions of the location, only limited to about 50% of all the water that would be coming to it. And when we worked out, a dollar amount for how much sediment that'd be, how much it would cost per pound of sediment, that was about $14. You don't need to remember these specifics. I want to make it relative to these other practices. So we got a lot going on right here, and I'm going to talk you through a few things. These are all the different practices that we looked at for this property that would be potential practices. When you think about this middle column, the dark green, these are all sorted by how much it costs to treat a pound of sediment. And these were all ranked. So you can see the cheapest BMPs were at the top, the most expensive BMPs were at the bottom. So this wasn't necessarily the expense to design and build it or to operate it, but the cost effectiveness when you're removing the pollutant. And off to the side, you see parking lot was kind of across the board, but you see lawn, the surface type is the top. You see road, you see driveway. So when you circle back over, when you're looking at what is the general cost to do treatment from those surfaces, you're looking at single figure units. When you get down to roof, you start getting into double, triple digits. Because there's less pollutant coming on. So you can have the same BMP. So all the kind of lighter green, the rain garden, the bioswales, the bioretention basin, all of those are the same mechanism. So we kind of ranked them the same way. But what I want to point out is it was more cost effective to have a rain garden or bioswale getting runoff from a parking lot than from a roof. And the bottom one was a rain garden that did not was not able to function. So because it couldn't function and couldn't get enough volume, it had no really pollutant reduction. So it was very very costly and not very effective. So what I want you to take away from that the different surface types and pollution loads had more influence than the effectiveness of a BMP. So the effectiveness is going to change based on what the runoff source is that you're coming in. So even with a less functioning or less effective BMP with a high pollutant source was more valuable than a very effective BMP with a low pollutant load source. So another benefit of green infrastructure, like I said, there was a lot of ecosystem benefits. You can absolutely incorporate trees into any green infrastructure. You'll see a lot of information about associating trees and green infrastructure, even nature, with health and well-being. So there's a lot of research out there associated with that. And that's probably another topic, a different presentation we could get into a different day. So what can you do? So these are two quotes I want to leave you with that I think are really inspiring. Again, going back to Wendell Berry, one of our Kentucky notables, do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you. And from Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So thank you so much. Sharing my contact information here. If you're like me, you'll probably have some follow-up questions or request some additional information. It might be later on this afternoon, it might be tomorrow, but know that you can reach out to me by phone or by email, and I'm certainly happy to address any questions at this time or in the future. And I think from that, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen. Let me see if I can get out of here.
Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Well,
and
I'll leave this up if can someone else, well, let's see. Bear with me here.
Yeah, that's okay. So we'll pause for a second in case anybody has questions. And of course, we can talk about things later on as you come up with things, maybe, as Russ said, another time. And we'll follow up after this presentation next week, probably with more information and copies of the slides. So not seeing any questions, I actually have a burning question.
All right.
Right. So thinking about what you were just talking about with that case study, And if it maybe we don't get the most benefit with having a rain garden that's focused on our roof, collecting the stormwater that's running off our roof on a residential area of our driveways might be more beneficial if we're thinking about those pollutant load reductions. So does that get more complicated in trying to have that water from your driveway go into a rain garden as opposed to, it seems a little bit easier to me to have your gutter go directly into the rain garden.
I'll say it is a trade-off. It is a little bit harder, it's a little bit more complicated, and it's a bigger reward. So yes, it is pretty easy, pretty simple, especially if you've already got a downspout, just running out another section of hose. It's easier to calculate, how much volume you might have coming off that rooftop. So I'm not saying don't do a rain garden. I'm just saying be aware that where you locate the rain garden is going to have a different capacity or different influence on the watershed as a whole. And I'm just putting it out there because I see, from what I've seen of a lot of rain garden information, it's generally associated with downspouts from rooftop, but I just don't want people to lose sight of, where's our big impact, where's our big pollutant sources. And, if we could do a rain barrel, or you can do a rain barrel and a rain garden, there's nothing to say you can't do both. But yeah, it can get kind of tricky. So I would look at areas that are really primed for that have some existing stormwater infrastructure or existing means of conveying water, and how you can kind of tap into that or do some retrofits. I think that's where you get a lot of bang for the buck. That might not be in the realm of residential or a homeowner or a weekend warrior go out and dig and put some plants in the ground. It is going to be a little bit more complicated, but again, I just want people to be aware of those kind of options.
Okay, great. And then thinking about this from, like a homeowner perspective, trying to figure out where do I need to be technical? Where can I kind of say, we have a little bit of a spectrum of doing different things. So it sounds like the most technical part is doing your perk test to begin with, making sure you're going to have that drainage and sizing it correctly. And then from there, you can kind of choose the plants that you want. Maybe that's not as much of the technical aspect. You're kind of trusting that as long as you've got, a decent amount of plants in there and give them time to fill in, should be good to go. Is that right?
Yep. Yep. And again, I kind of want to cover that broader perspective of the soils. That's really going to be a big limitation to how well the rain garden is going to infiltrate. I don't believe the types of plants or maybe how you've got them arranged is going to have as much of an effect on infiltration rates. So I really focus on the soils for doing a lot of that heavy lifting or the work. I think of the plants kind of the icing on the cake. As long as you get the cake baked right and it's good and stout and it's going to support everything, the icing's going to be whatever kind of flavoring you want to add to it. It depends on the individual person, the property it's at, what kind of plant schemes you want to use. So I think there's a lot of variability and flexibility in the plants in and of themselves. Again, that's not generally what I use to define the rain garden. So I think that's where, if you get the soils right, if you get it sized pretty well, so it's big enough to receive some of those bigger storms that we might get, not too small. I think that's, once you get that worked out, you're good.
Okay, awesome. Good stuff. Oh, question. Do you have a larger vision for collecting runoff from agricultural fields?
That's a good question. I know there's a lot of talk, at least discourse, in the Gulf of Mexico, the hypoxia zone. Where is all this nutrients coming from? I know that a lot of people often look at agricultural runoff as maybe one of the big components, although I don't believe it's necessarily any bigger than the urban areas. I think urban areas have a part in a lot of runoff, especially if you look in a neighborhood like mine where people want the greenest grass and they put a lot of fertilizer on it. From the research I've seen, there is a lot more nutrients, fertilizer overuse in urban areas. Generally, farmers are fairly practical and prudent people. If I could make that categorization. So generally farmers are going to do a soil test and they're going to provide as much fertilizer as they do need. They don't generally over fertilize their farms, over fertilize their lands. They're usually pretty well spot on. So it's generally more of the urban areas that get a lot of this nitrogen, phosphorus runoff. So that's a little bit addressing the agricultural areas. On the other end to that is often there's a lot of programs like cost share programs through NRCS and USDA that specifically address a lot of agricultural context where you could use a variety of different practices. They don't necessarily use the term BMP in the agricultural context, but it's the same kind of thing where you're using grasses, you're using trees, you're using shrubs, your landscape, you're conveying water and generally putting in a buffer or a grassed waterway. And there's a lot of programs through those NRCS cost share type practices that use what I would say just the same kind of processes and same kind of mechanisms as rain gardens, but it's not necessarily a bowled out or landscaped or might not be a very meticulous kind of planting. Looking at something on a larger scale. So I don't know if that really addressed the question, but that's a good question. I hope I did my best to get that one.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess I'll just add too, and not making any inferences on the question or placing blame in any way, but I think in the past, we could sort of say, well, a lot of our nutrient issues and bacteria were coming from agriculture, but our land use has changed quite a bit in the past, 20, 30, 50 years. And so, speaking from the Currys Fork watershed, we're not really concerned with ag because we, yes, we do have some agriculture in our area we're looking at, but it's a lot more minimal, and our sources of pollution are really coming from those residential and developed areas. So that's where we get into what is the area of land that we're looking at. So, and there are a lot of programs out there, like Russ said, for farmers. Not to say everybody's taking advantage of them. We need education everywhere still, but that urban component, that residential component, is really where we need to hit more if we're gonna, have improvements. Well, I'll take over from here, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and I'm going to start from here. So I'm just going to we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm just going to take a couple minutes and talk about the rain garden that we installed with UDEL at UDEL last fall. Okay, so this is an aerial view from Google Maps of the UDEL property. If you haven't been at UDEL, it's right off of 146 near North Camden Lane and Old LaGrange Road. This I have circled right here in red. This is where the basin is that became our rain garden. So this area, it was an existing basin that was taking stormwater from this pavilion here and from some other areas at the UDEL campus. So this is a pre-rain garden project picture. So it was an existing basin that was meant to channel that runoff, that stormwater, and then go out away from this basin into, they have a big open field here. So a lot of people, if you're going to build a rain garden, usually it's from scratch, but they did have an existing area, which just made sense of why we would select this as our site for the rain garden. And then the UDEL staff prepped this site for us, just backing up a second. So this project was funded through our Currys Fork funding, which comes from grant funding that is ultimately from federal funding from the Clean Water Act. So the UDEL staff, they came in, they removed the riprap, they cut the bank back, they made the site, that basin from the last picture, they made it a lot bigger. So they really expanded the site. And they built up a dam or a berm to make sure that water stays in there. They added a pipe, so if you have an overflow, that water, excess water, would then be able to drain through. And that's one of the differences, I think, between more of a larger scale or commercial site compared to residential, is having more of that infrastructure. On most residential sites, you're not going to be adding, installing any type of pipe. As long as you have a way for that water to overflow, you're likely going to be fine. But Russ, maybe you have additional comments there, but I'll leave it there for now. And then they went in, they added a mixture, again, getting that soil right for planting, added a mixture of pine fines, compost, and sand, and then prepped it for planting. So then they developed their planting plan for the site. So you can see that here. And they had a mixture of, let's see, the Asclepias, so that's the milkweeds, Echinacea, those are the coneflowers, cup plant, lobelias, hibiscus, I don't know all of these. Mostly a native or some derivative, I'll say, of a native, focusing on plants that are going to be do well with the site, but also being Udell Botanical Gardens, using plants that are going to be showy and appreciated by passersby. We had a volunteer planting event because, of course, we want to use the community and volunteers as much as possible. I should say engage rather than use, but our emphasis is that if you do something, if you get out there, get your hands in the dirt, see the plants, are involved in something, that's really the best way to learn and understand and take the concerns and the risk and the apprehension out of doing a lot of this stuff, because it's really intuitive and it's not very complicated. So as much as we can get people involved and take all those concerns away and have a good time, that's what we're trying to do. So we had a volunteer event last fall. And then we had about 9 people between Curry's Fork Friends, Udell volunteers came in. And one thing I've learned is that it's really, really quick to plant a site. The biggest effort is really that pre-planning and that getting the site prepped. But once you do that, your site's prepped. I think we got this planted in an hour and a half. So really quick and easy and fun. This was last November. And then one of the Udell volunteers, they had a drone. And so we got some of those pictures, and that just looks really awesome to see the site from above. Again, this is the sort of pre and post. So those plants were set up, what that looks like, getting all the plants kind of where you want them. So when people come in, they know exactly where to plant them. That's predetermined based on the plants that are going to do best in the middle of the site where there's more water. And then also that effect of, you can have it look however you want, and you might want your taller plants in the back or certain shorter plants in the front. You don't want them to get drowned out by the taller ones. And then we mulched it. So now it looks like we buried the plants, but we covered them, because going into winter and then having that protection of those plants as they go into winter, as they start to get established, making them nice and cozy and ready to start putting roots down and getting ready for the spring. So these pictures were taken by Udell staff in May. And so some of the plants, we can see some of them coming up. And I know, talking with Udell, sometimes things take a little bit of time to get working. Sometimes we don't know if our rain gardens are working properly. So just understanding that it's okay if it doesn't look exactly how you envisioned, or maybe to not be sure if it's working properly, just paying attention to what's happening and maybe tweaking here and there. So they went in and they added some more plants, which they intended to do to begin with. And this was taken this week, I believe, again by Udell staff, and they're telling me it's working really great. So that's really awesome to hear. But again, something we're going to keep looking at and seeing how it's doing, and if we need to add some more plants, or if somehow it's been ponding longer than we want, what do we need to change? And just understanding that everything can still be a little bit of a work in process. And as you're going through this, hopefully on your property, that you might go through that as well. And then just quickly sharing that there are lots of resources and free programming out there for you. I'll just mention a couple of here. I'm just trying to move this so you can see. Let's see, there we go. So Oldham County Soil and Water Conservation District, great resource. They currently have a pollinator native plant cost share. So anybody is eligible for this, you can contact them. We'll add this to the resources that we send out, but you can essentially plant your rain garden, plant a pollinator garden, and get some funding back to help with that. They also have soil testing, which we'd recommend if you have a garden, vegetable garden, or maybe you want to test the soil at the site that you want the rain garden. They provide free soil testing every year. They also have a compost program, and I'm sure they have other things going on that that you'd want to check out too. Oldham County Cooperative Extension Service, so also typically just known as Cooperative Extension, similar resources available, technical assistance, different programmings there. And then talking about the native plants, I just encourage people to focus on native plants. If you really love a plant and it's not native, as long as it's not invasive, going to spread everywhere, then there's no problems with having those plants around. But really focusing as much as we can on the natives, because those are the plants that are going to help our wildlife and be most beneficial to that strong ecological system that we're trying to develop. So resources for that as well. And then I think that's it for me here. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, one more slide. So we sent this out already. We'll send these out again. There are some rain garden manuals for you. We don't expect you to go through this workshop and then immediately be able to figure things out, although if you can, that's awesome. But there's some different manuals. I'd recommend the Bluegrass Green Source, and then Louisville MSD also has a rain garden manual to get into more specifics, the measurements, the perk tests, where to put your rain garden. And then if you search online rain gardens, you'll find an endless amount of resources. So definitely reach out with questions. If you find a really awesome resource, please share that with the group. And I believe with that, that is my last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we are right about time here. Does anybody else have any questions or any comments or something you want to chat about?
And Becca, I'm just going to say that we'll be sending out this recording so everyone will have access to these great resources. And also we are partnering with Oldham County Extension in October for an improving garden soil workshop. So I think that'll be great. So if you are not, folks, if you haven't signed up for our mailing list, reach out. I will also do some follow-ups to workshop participants when that that date is announced, but we'd love for you to join in and just continue with your learning adventures with us. So if there's not anything else for anybody, any last questions?
I just see a comment from somebody, Louisville Water Company will send you free seeds and a guide if you request it for a rain garden. So that's good to know.
Oh, that's very cool. That's very cool.
And
okay, any other comments?
Well, I would like to say thank you for Becca and Susan for getting all this coordinated and getting this together. I really appreciate the time that you all have taken to do this. I know it's really important for the watershed. And thanks to everybody for attending. I think you're going to go out there and do some great things. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Russ. Thank you, Becca. Becca, any last words?
If you have a rain garden or you plan to install one, please let us know. We want to see it or help if you need help. We're available. So you're not alone. And it's really great if people can share what they're doing with the community, because then it just more people will get interested and want to do it as well. And it's fun if you have an interest in putting down a rain garden, but say, maybe it's harder for you to get out there and dig and do plants. We're building a volunteer group to support that in the community. So just don't be shy about what's going on or what you need. But we'll leave it there and let you get on with the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. We'll hope to see you soon out here in the gardens or on Zoom. Thank you.
Thanks.